Imagine this. You're standing in the middle of a car dealership. It's a weekday, Tuesday. No rush, no drama. You have the money, you have the credit score. You've done everything the system ever asked of you. And yet, there are no cars. The lot is empty. No rows of shining metal. No choices. Just silence, except for one sad-looking sedan pushed to the side, wearing a markup so obscene it costs more than your first year of college tuition. You ask the salesman why? He shrugs. Maybe a factory in Malaysia lost power 3 weeks ago. Maybe a ship drifted sideways in a narrow canal in Egypt. Maybe 2 politicians on opposite sides of the planet stopped returning each other's phone calls. And suddenly, your life, your plans, your money, your future are on hold. This is the moment when the illusion breaks. For 30 years, we lived inside a fantasy. A beautiful one. A convenient one. We told ourselves the world was flat. That borders were outdated relics. That geopolitics was something dusty historians argued about, not something that could stop you from buying a car. We believed you could design a phone in California, source its minerals from Africa, manufacture its chips in Taiwan, assemble it in China, ship it across the Pacific, and sell it in Europe seamlessly, invisibly, effortlessly. We called this miracle globalization, and for a while it felt like magic. Cheap t-shirts that cost less than lunch. $500 TVs with more computing power than NASA had during the moon landing. Fresh avocados in December, flown thousands of miles so you never had to think about seasons again. Globalization wasn't just an economic system, it was a lifestyle subsidy. And now quietly, steadily, unmistakably, that subsidy is being withdrawn. The party is ending. The lights are coming on. The music has stopped, and the geopolitical hangover is setting in. Welcome to the era of deglobalization. Welcome to the age of trade blocs. And if inflation already felt uncomfortable, brace yourself, because this isn't just about prices. This is about the architecture of the entire world being rebuilt under your feet while you still standing on it. To understand how we got here, we have to rewind. Specifically, to the period between 1989 and roughly 2016, what economists now call the Golden Age of Globalization. The Berlin Wall falls, the Soviet Union collapses, and for the first time in modern history, there appears to be no rival system left standing. Capitalism wins. Liberal democracy wins. Markets win. This victory bred confidence. Then arrogance. A political scientist named Francis Fukuyama famously declared this moment the end of history. Not the end of events, but the end of ideological struggle. The idea was simple, seductive, and catastrophically wrong. Free markets had proven themselves superior. Liberal democracy had no competitor. Major wars between powerful nations were now obsolete. Why would countries fight when they could trade? Why drop bombs on a nation that manufactures your sneakers? This thinking crystallized into something almost comical, yet deeply influential. The McDonald's theory of peace. The belief that no 2 countries with McDonald's would ever go to war with each other. History, unfortunately, does not respect branding. What globalization really did was reorder incentives. Supply chains stretched across continents. Corporations optimized relentlessly for cost. Governments outsourced risk without realizing it. Factories moved to wherever labor was cheapest. Energy flowed from wherever it was most abundant. Capital chased returns without allegiance to flags. And for decades, it worked. Inflation stayed low. Corporate profits exploded. Consumers grew accustomed to abundance without fragility. But beneath the surface, something dangerous was forming. Globalization wasn't creating resilience. It was creating interdependence without trust. A system where everything depended on everything else, yet no one was responsible for the whole. And systems like that don't fail loudly at first. They fail silently, then suddenly. By the late 2010s, the cracks were already visible. Trade wars replaced trade agreements. Sanctions became policy tools instead of last resorts. Supply chains once invisible started appearing in headlines. Then came the 2020s, a decade that stress-tested every assumption globalization was built on. A pandemic that froze factories overnight. A single ship blocking a canal and halting billions in trade. Wars that reminded the world's energy is never just energy, it's power. Suddenly, governments noticed something terrifying. They no longer controlled the foundations of their own economies. Medicines were made abroad. Chips were made abroad. Energy was imported from rivals. Food systems depended on uninterrupted global logistics. Efficiency had won. Security had lost. And security, it turns out, is non-negotiable. The world didn't deglobalize overnight. It fractured. Trade didn't stop, it reorganized. The open ocean of global commerce began retreating into fortified blocks. On one side, a US-lined bloc, North America, Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia. On another, a China-lined bloc bound by supply chains, infrastructure, and strategic dependence. And in between, a vast group of non-aligned countries, India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, Turkey playing both sides. Negotiating leverage barrel by barrel, contract by contract. This isn't just politics. This is why your fridge costs more. Why factories are reopening in places long written off. Why your job might come back, but your purchasing power doesn't. The next 10 years will not resemble the last 30. And to understand why we have to dismantle the myths that built globalization in the first place. Because what's dying isn't trade. It's the belief that trade could replace power, politics, and geography. And the first myth to fall was the idea that efficiency could replace resilience. That story begins with something deceptively boring: inventory. To understand why globalization is retreating, we need to understand the belief system that ruled the corporate world for nearly half a century. It wasn't a policy. It wasn't a law. It was a religion, and its name was just in time. Picture yourself as a manufacturing executive in the mid-1990s. You walk through your company's warehouse. You see stacks of tires, crates of microchips, pallets of steel and plastic sitting quietly under fluorescent lights. To an engineer, this looks like preparedness. To a modern executive, it looks like a sin. Because in the language of late 20th century capitalism, inventory wasn't safety. It was waste. Idle capital. Money not working. Cash rotting on the floor. So you hire consultants. They arrive in tailored suits, armed with spreadsheets and confidence. They tell you something revolutionary. Why store anything at all? Why not have the truck deliver the tires exactly 4 hours before they re-bolted onto the car? Why not time every component so precisely that nothing ever sits still? This idea wasn't invented on Wall Street. It came from post-war Japan, specifically from Toyota. Japan had no room for waste. Limited land, limited capital, limited margin for error. So Toyota perfected a system where parts arrived exactly when needed, no earlier, no later. The Toyota production system became the envy of the world. And once American and European corporations adopted it, just-in-time became doctrine. Warehouses were sold off. Inventory buffers were eliminated. Supply chains stretched across oceans, synchronized by software and faith. The global economy transformed into a perfectly wound clock. A component made in Shenzhen on Monday, shipped on Tuesday, arrives in Los Angeles on Wednesday, installed on Thursday, sold to you on Friday. It was breathtaking and catastrophically fragile. Here's the uncomfortable truth corporate culture avoided for decades. Efficiency is the enemy of resilience. When you remove every ounce of slack, you remove the system's ability to absorb shock. Just-in-time works beautifully, as long as nothing goes wrong, as long as no ports close, no factories shut down, no wars start, no pandemics emerge, no ships get stuck sideways in critical choke points. Then came the 2020s, a decade that tested every weak assumption at once. You probably remember the Ever Given. A single container shipped longer than the Eiffel Tower wedged diagonally in the Suez Canal. For 6 days, it blocked one of the most important arteries of global trade. Over $60 billion of goods were frozen in place. Toilet paper, coffee, industrial inputs, and, yes, garden gnomes. It became a meme, but it shouldn't have been funny. Because the real problem wasn't the ship. It was that nobody had backups. No inventories, no slack, no alternative routes. One failure cascaded into thousands. That's what tightly coupled systems do. Then came the semiconductor famine of 2021, a case study in how globalization quietly sabotaged itself. For decades, car manufacturers like Ford, GM, and Volkswagen outsourced chip production to East Asia, especially Taiwan. Why wouldn't they? Chips were cheap, foundries were reliable, and inventory was inefficient, so they kept almost none. When COVID hit, automakers panicked. They assumed demand would collapse. They canceled their chip orders. At the same time, something unexpected happened. You stayed home. And with stimulus checks and boredom, you bought laptops, game consoles, monitors, phones. So chip foundries zesibly TSM serial-located capacity to Apple, Sony, and Nvidia. Perfectly rational behavior. Months later, car companies returned. Okay, they said. We're ready now. The answer was devastatingly simple. Take a number. Wait time, 52 weeks. Suddenly, billions of dollars worth of nearly finished vehicles sat idle in parking lots, rotting because they were missing a chip that cost less than a dinner. This wasn't a freak accident. It was the logical conclusion of just in time. So the doctrine cracked. And when religions fail, heresies rise. Enter just in case. Corporate boardrooms didn't suddenly become philosophical. They became terrified. Executives stopped asking, "How cheap can this be?" They started asking, "Will this exist when we need it?" Warehouses are back. Inventory is back. Redundancy, once heresies, now strategy. Factories are being moved. Not to the cheapest places, but to the friendliest ones. This is called friend-shoring. China to Mexico. China to Vietnam. Asia back to North America, or fully reshored home. From Guangdong to Arizona. From Shenzhen to Ohio. And this shift has consequences. Huge ones. Resilience is expensive. Inventory costs money. Warehouses cost money. Duplicated factories cost money. And labor costs matter again. Paying American or Mexican wages instead of Vietnamese wages costs money. Every layer of safety added back into the system comes with a price tag. And that price tag doesn't land on corporate balance sheets forever. It lands on you. The $10 toaster is disappearing, not because companies got greedy, but because the supply chain that made it possible depended on perfect peace, perfect logistics, and perfect trust. That world is gone. We are trading efficiency for reliability, low prices for certainty, speed for security. And this is only the beginning, because corporations are rebuilding supply chains to protect profits. Governments are rebuilding them to protect survival. And when national survival enters the equation, markets stop being free. What we're witnessing isn't just an economic shift, it's a psychological one. For the first time in decades, the world's most powerful institutions are planning not for growth, but for disruption. And once that mindset takes hold, globalization as we knew it cannot survive. Because the next phase isn't driven by accountants. It's driven by strategists. And the most dangerous realization they've had is this: interdependence can be weaponized. If historians ever need to mark the exact moment globalization truly died, not weakened, not cracked, but irreversibly broken, they may settle on a quiet Friday afternoon. October 7th, 2022. No tanks rolled across borders, no missiles lit up the sky. No emergency sirens sounded. Instead, something far more subtle happened. The U.S. Bureau of Industry and Security, an agency so obscure most Americans had never heard of it, released a 139-page document. And with that document, the United States demonstrated something the world could no longer ignore. Globalization wasn't just an economic system, it was a weapon. The new rules banned China from accessing the most advanced semiconductors on Earth and, more importantly, the machines required to manufacture them. This wasn't a trade dispute. This was a technological decapitation attempt. To understand why this mattered, you need to grasp a concept scholars Henry Farrell and Abraham Newman gave a name 2 years earlier: weaponized interdependence. For decades, globalization was sold as a flat web, everyone connected to everyone else. Mutually dependent, equally vulnerable. That story was comforting. It was also false. The global economy isn't flat. It's a hub-and-spoke system. And if you control the hub, you don't need bombs. You can strangle entire industries with paperwork. There is no better illustration of this than a quiet town in the Netherlands most people can pronounce. Veldhoven. This is where ASML is headquartered. And ASML may be the single most important company on Earth that no one talks about. ASML holds a literal monopoly. It is the only company capable of building extreme ultraviolet lithography machines, UVs. These machines are engineering insanity. They're the size of a bus. They cost over $200 million each. They fire lasers at microscopic droplets of molten tin 50,000 times per second, creating light hotter than the surface of the sun. That light etches circuits onto silicon at scales approaching atoms. Without EUV machines, no cutting-edge iPhones, no NVIDIA AI accelerators, no modern fighter jets, no advanced missile systems. In other words, number 21st century power. China knows this, the US knows this. And on October 7th, the US pulled the kill switch. Washington didn't act alone. They leaned on allies, the Netherlands, Japan. Together, they blocked ASML from selling advanced machines, and even spare parts to China. Imagine waking up as a Chinese tech executive the next morning. Your factories are still running. Your workers still show up. But you know something terrifying. In 2 or 3 years, your machines will break. And when they do, no replacement parts, no software updates, no new models. Your industry isn't collapsing today. It's dying in slow motion. This shattered the core assumption globalization depended on: trust. Because once you see that interdependence can be turned off at will, you never unsee it. If the US can cripple your technology sector with a policy memo, why would you ever rely on US-controlled technology again? You wouldn't. You'd rebuild everything at any cost. And that's exactly what's happening. We are witnessing the splintering of technology itself. 2 stacks are emerging. A Western stack, a Chinese stack. Different chips, different software, different standards, incompatible, hostile. Expensive efficiency is irrelevant now. Control is everything. And once technology fractures, globalization loses its nervous system. But technology wasn't the first lifeline to snap. Energy broke even harder. Because energy isn't just another input. Energy is the bloodstream of civilization. And Europe made a bet that now defines the entire era. For decades, Germany, Europe's industrial heart, believed in something called Wandel durch Handel, change through trade. The logic was elegant. We buy cheap gas from Russia. Russia gets rich. Russia integrates with Europe. And no one fights their biggest customer. Factories hum, households stay warm. Everyone wins. It was a beautiful theory. It was also a strategic hallucination. When Russia invaded Ukraine, that illusion detonated overnight. Germany realized that sourcing 55% of your gas from a geopolitical rival isn't economic pragmatism. It's a suicide pact. Pipelines that once symbolized cooperation became chokepoints. And Europe faced an impossible choice: cut off Russian energy and risk industrial collapse, or keep buying and fund a war they publicly condemned. What followed wasn't deglobalization. It was something darker. Globalization went underground. Russia didn't stop selling oil. It rerouted it. Enter the Shadow Fleet, an armada of over 600 aging, uninsured tankers sailing without GPS, performing ship-to-ship transfers in international waters. Oil changes hands in the dark. Paper trails vanish. Europe still burns Russian hydrocarbons just laundered through India, China, and intermediaries. This is global trade without rules, without insurance, without accountability. If one of these rusting ships spills millions of barrels of oil, no one pays. The environment absorbs the cost. Taxpayers absorb the rest. This is what fractured globalization looks like. Meanwhile, Europe replaced cheap pipeline gas with LNG, gas frozen to -162 degrees Celsius, shipped across oceans, regasified at port. Pipeline gas costs pennies to move. LNG costs dollars. That difference is permanent. Which means European industry is now structurally less competitive than it was 5 years ago. Chemical giants like BASF aren't waiting this out. They're shutting plants in Germany and reopening them in the US and China. Energy geography matters again. friendship has a price. And neutrality no longer exists. Globalization promised a world where geography didn't matter. This decade is proving the opposite. It matters more than ever. And when energy, technology, and trust all fracture at once, the system doesn't adapt. It reorganizes. Through subsidies, through protectionism, through force. Which brings us to the next phase. When governments decide markets can no longer be trusted. When markets fail to deliver security, governments step in. Not gently, not efficiently, but decisively. For nearly 40 years, industrial policy was treated like a taboo in Western economics. The government wasn't supposed to pick winners and losers. Markets were sacred. Efficiency was king. Solar panels were cheaper to make in China, so be it. Chips were cheaper in Taiwan, fine. If factories hollowed out entire regions, it's unfortunate but efficient. That era is over. And nothing marks its burial more clearly than a bill passed in the United States with one of the most misleading names in modern history. The Inflation Reduction Act. Despite the branding, this legislation has almost nothing to do with inflation. It is, in essence, a declaration of economic war. The U.S. government backed a dump truck filled with $369 billion and, likely far more over time, man-parked it in front of corporate America. The message was blunt. Build your batteries here, mine your lithium here, assemble your electric vehicles here, or don't and watch your competitors take the subsidies instead. And it worked. Massive factories are rising in Ohio, Arizona, Georgia. Chip plants in deserts. Battery plants in former Rust Belts. America is rebuilding fast. But the story doesn't stop there. Because when one superpower subsidizes, others don't sit still. They panic. Europe watched investment flow west and sounded the alarm. That's unfair, they said. You're draining our industry. So the EU responded with its own subsidies. Then Japan followed. Then South Korea. Then China, already a veteran of state-backed capitalism, doubled down. We are now in a subsidy arms race. Every major power is spending billions of taxpayer dollars to recreate supply chains that already exist somewhere else. Instead of one global factory producing widgets for $1, we now have 5 national factories producing them for $3, and the cost is paid twice. Once through taxes, once through prices. This isn't efficiency, it's insurance. It's expensive. But while rich nations are building subsidy fortresses, the rest of the world is doing something far more consequential. They're opting out. Welcome to the quiet revolt of the Global South. For years, Western economists dismissed BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa as a talking shop. Photo ops, complaints, no real power. That laughter stopped in 2022 when the West froze $300 billion of Russia's foreign reserves. With a keystroke. For many countries watching from the sidelines, the message was chilling. If this can happen to Russia, it can happen to anyone. The result was not the collapse of the dollar, but something more subtle and more dangerous. A global de-risking. Trade in yuan, oil in rupees. Settlements in dirhams, messy, inefficient, but politically safer. This isn't about ideology. It's about survival. And nothing reveals that more clearly than gold. Central banks are buying gold at the fastest pace since the 1960s. Not because it yields interest, not because it's fashionable, but because gold is the only asset that isn't someone else's liability. You can't sanction a gold bar sitting in your own vault. That reality terrifies the architects of the old system, because it means we are drifting from one global rulebook to many competing ones. Imagine a future where your credit card works in New York and London but is declined in Beijing. Not because of fraud. Because the payment systems no longer talk to each other. We are already halfway there. And just as the financial system fractures, another silent force is accelerating deglobalization from below. Demographics. The hidden engine of the entire system. Globalization 1.0 wasn't just about free trade. It was about cheap labor. Specifically, hundreds of millions of young Chinese workers entering the global economy at once. This kept wages low. Prices down, inflation contained. But history doesn't pause. China is now facing one of the fastest demographic collapses ever recorded outside war or plague. In 2023, its population began shrinking. By 2050, China is projected to lose a population equivalent to the entire United States. This is the Lewis turning point. The moment surplus labor disappears and wages rise permanently. Chinese factory wages have tripled in a decade. Made in China is no longer cheap, so companies fleet to Vietnam, India, Mexico. But here's the problem. There is no new China. Vietnam is too small. India has the people but not the infrastructure cohesion. Mexico is getting expensive fast. The deflationary engine that powered globalization is stalling, and it isn't coming back. In the future, your goods won't be made by cheap workers. They'll be made by expensive robots. And robots don't work for free. They require capital, energy, and maintenance, which means higher prices structurally. The era of deflation is ending. The era of permanent price pressure is beginning. Before we move on, pause for a moment. Look at your grocery bill, your rent, your subscriptions. This isn't temporary. This is the bill coming due. And the final accelerant, the one few people talk about openly, is disguised as moral progress. Climate. For decades, trade wars were easy to spot. Tariffs, quotas, sanctions, blunt instruments, openly hostile. The new trade war wears a cleaner uniform. It speaks the language of morality, of responsibility, of saving the planet. And that makes it far more powerful. Enter the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. CBAM, a name only a bureaucrat could love. Here's how it works. European factories operate under strict environmental regulations. They must buy carbon permits. Pollution has a price. That makes producing steel, cement, and chemicals in Europe expensive. Meanwhile, factories in India, Turkey, or Southeast Asia can produce the same goods more cheaply because they pollute more freely. So the EU says this: if you want to sell your dirty steel in Europe, you must pay a tax at the border that equalizes the cost. On paper, it's climate policy. In practice, it's a protectionist wall. And Europe isn't alone. The UK is following. The US is considering similar measures. This divides the world into two economic zones: a high-cost green zone, the West; a low-cost carbon zone, much of the developing world. If you're a developing nation, this feels like betrayal. The countries that polluted their way to wealth are now pulling up the ladder, charging you for trying to climb it. This kills trade deals. It reshapes supply chains not around efficiency but carbon accounting. And it effectively ends the authority of the World Trade Organization. Y2 rules say you can't discriminate against imports. CBM says, watch us. Globalization required common rules. We are replacing them with moralized borders. But physical goods aren't the only thing fragmenting. The final fracture runs through something we once believed was immune to borders: the Internet. For 20 years, we believed in a single digital commons. One web, one conversation, one global marketplace of ideas. That dream is over. We now live in the era of the splinternet. It began with China's great firewall blocking Google, Facebook, YouTube. We told ourselves that was an exception. It wasn't. Europe built data borders with GDPR. Russia built Runet, an internet it can sever from the world in seconds. The US is attempting to ban or force the sale of TikTok, not because of dancing teenagers, but because of data sovereignty. Data is the new oil. And governments don't want their citizens' data flowing through rival states. The result? The death of the global launch. Startups now build multiple versions of the same product, one for the US, one for Europe, one for China. Innovation fragments. Costs rise. Ideas spread slower. The World Wide Web becomes a network of walled gardens. Your digital passport increasingly determines what reality you're allowed to see. And when you zoom out far enough, you see the pattern. Supply chains fragment. Energy markets split. Technology standards diverge. Currencies hedge. Data walls rise. All of it points to the same outcome: inflation. Not cyclical, not temporary, structural. For 30 years, globalization suppressed inflation. It allowed labor arbitrage, inventory minimization, energy optimization. Deglobalization reverses every one of those forces. Redundancy costs money. Friendshoring costs money. Subsidies cost money. Higher wages cost money. Carbon compliance costs money. Central banks can raise interest rates. But interest rates can't produce more workers. They can't unbreak supply chains. They can't force trust between rivals. We are moving from an economy optimized for efficiency to one optimized for security. Security has a premium, and we are all paying it. So where does this leave us? Is globalization dead? No, but the version we grew up with is. We aren't returning to the Middle Ages. Trade will continue. Bananas will still cross oceans. Anime will still stream across borders. But hyperglobalization, the belief in one seamless, borderless market is finished. In its place is something colder, a world of blocks. Democratic blocks, authoritarian blocks, transactional middle powers. Trade within blocks will continue. Between blocks will be fragile. This is a more dangerous world, where economic rivalry bleeds into military tension faster than we'd like to admit. But there is a silver lining. The chaos forces rebuilding. Industrial bases return. Resilience matters again. Long-term thinking regains value. It will be slower, more expensive, less comfortable, but also more honest. The end of history is over. History is back, and it has unfinished business. If you've made it this far, you're not just living inside the system, you're trying to understand it. And in a decade like this, understanding may be the most valuable asset of all. Stay skeptical, stay curious, and stay prepared.